Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's humbling and intimidating to follow such an erudite and amazing discussion of this important topic. I think the issue of negative tribalism, there's a positive aspect of it, of course, but of negative tribalism, if you want to save a little time, I think you could just call it fascism. Is the issue of our generation, the fight of our generation, and I think possibly the fight of human history for as long as we will exist. I think it will always be a struggle. My father, well, before I get to him, let me just get this out of the way. I'm an unabashed, lifelong liberal, and I hope to offer an unabashed critique of the liberal attempts to combat negative tribalism. My father was a refugee 3 times over, born in Dresden in 1923. His father was Jewish. They fled in 1933 to Spain. They left 3 years later when the fascists came into Spain under Franco. Went to France. We know what happened there. Moved to Portugal, neutral country, and eventually to this country. He came here and stayed here because, as he said, fascism would never follow him to these shores. I still believe that to be true. I like to say that because of the fascists, my father spoke 5 languages fluently because they chased him around Europe for his entire youth. He experienced negative tribalism. I had a different experience as an American. I experienced the positive aspects of it, and I was lucky to. As a foreign reporter, as a war reporter, I found myself in 1998, I think it was, in Sierra Leone during the Civil War. I was up country in a small town called Kenema that was about to be attacked by the RUF, a fearsome rebel group known for unspeakable atrocities. They'd overrun a UN base and were headed for Kenema. And I remember in those terrifying hours and days, I remember people gathering on the street in a panic. And I remember the women screaming at the men, "Go out and defend us. That's your job. Fight, stop the RUF from overrunning this town." And they did. The men grabbed cutlasses and shotguns and old hunting rifles and a couple of rusty AK-47s and managed to defend Kenema. Some years later, in New York City, during Hurricane Sandy, the lights went out from 34th Street down. So nighttime in New York without lights is pretty frightening. And the woman who I later married, Barbara, lived in the Lower East Side, where we all live now. She and our daughters and I live now in a tenement building in the Lower East Side. Mixed race, mixed language, mostly Spanish speaking in this neighborhood, in this building. And when the lights went out for a week, the frankly poor people of this building were really scared of break-ins. It's a rough neighborhood. So what happened? One of the mothers found a machete and organized a guard roster of young men that she knew. And they took turns at the front door with the machete until the lights came back on in New York City. One of the interesting things about this, other than this amazing loyalty to one's own, is that we must understand women are absolutely capable of violence, of using violence, if circumstances demand it. Let us not think otherwise, that there are 2 sexes, one's violent, the other isn't. Women are far too practical to not think in those terms when forced to. They often have their men commit their violence for them, but they are perfectly capable of thinking in those terms if it's required. And then finally, I was with some American forces, 173rd Airborne in eastern Afghanistan, in a very intense area. There was a lot of combat, a lot of casualties. I spent a year off and on with a platoon, which is 30, 40, 50 men. It was all men. It's combat infantry, so it was all male, at this little outpost called Restrepo. And one of the guys said to me at one point, you know, it's amazing. He said, there's guys in the platoon who straight up hate each other, but we would all die for each other. That is positive tribalism. It's this transcendent feeling that I do not matter, my group matters, and I will do anything for it. Understand that we are the only animal that thinks this way. Our closest mammalian relatives, chimpanzees, do not. We are the only species where a young male will willingly die for a same-sex peer that he's not related to, simply because they are part of the same group. It is a profound form of love. And it helped me understand. I wrote a book called Tribe. It took me years to be able to define the word. I finally thought of it one day not too long ago. Tribe is this idea: what happens to you happens to me. If you are hungry, I'm hungry with you. If you're in danger, I am in danger with you. We will get through this together, or we will perish together. That's the positive aspect of the word tribe. It is one of the most intoxicating experiences you can have as a human being, is to feel that. It is akin to, it's on a par with romantic love in its intensity, in its sense of transcendence, and it's with an entire group of people. Understand that no society can survive if it doesn't defend itself, if it can't defend itself. Just ask the good people of Ukraine. What's sustaining them right now in their fight against, I'll just say it, fascism, the military incursion by Putin's forces into their country, is a sense of unity, a sense of we are Ukrainian, we are defending our families, our homes, our land, our traditions, our history, our values. Reason cannot do that for us. Reason is an amazing tool for understanding how the world works. Emotions provide motivation. Emotions like fear, like anger, like love, envy. Those are the things that motivate us. Reason will never carry the day against emotions. If you don't believe me, just think back, cast back in your mind. If you have ever tried to use calm and dispassionate reason with an upset lover or sibling or child, it doesn't work. Emotions win. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is how do we uncover the positive emotions around the sense of tribe and tribal responsibility. Can we elevate the idea of what happens to you happens to me? Can we elevate that? I think the question at this forum is, can we scale that up from a small human group of the sort that typifies our history as a species to a town, a nation, even a species? Can we scale that up or not? It remains to be seen. But make no mistake about it, it scales up with emotion, not with reason. Reason is for other things. So I'm going to speak briefly about our human origins. I'm an anthropologist by training. The biology, the hard sciences, the social sciences are infamous for sort of trampling on political pieties, on cherished cultural ideals. But this issue of fascism, of equality, of fairness in society is so important, it deserves an honest and clear discussion, which is what I'm going to do. And I hope I don't make anyone uncomfortable or offend them, but that might be just part of the process of fighting these evils, is that some people will be possibly discomforted at times. We evolved as a species in groups of 30 to 50 people for most of our human history, intensely loyal to each other. They were a survival group. Humans were largely patrilocal, which means the woman moved in with into the man's community, into the man's family, which had the distinct advantage of keeping male blood kin together as a fighting group. Hugely advantageous on the battlefield. you almost certainly would die for your brother or your sister, but maybe not your brother-in-law in another community, right? So keeping the male kin together is very effective in preserving the physical safety of one's community. And these early human communities and current-day hunter-gatherers are enormously egalitarian. The Hadza, one of the last of the hunter-gathering societies in the world, well-studied, they have a Gini coefficient of 0.25. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Gini coefficient. A score of 0 means that everyone has exactly the same thing, which isn't particularly ideal for humans, right? A score of 1 means that one person has everything and no one else has anything. Obviously not ideal. 0.25 is sort of the sweet spot for human society. By comparison, the US has a Gini coefficient after taxes of 0.4, which is roughly the equivalent of the Roman Empire. And before taxes, we are at 0.6, which is the equivalent of extremely corrupt countries like Haiti and Botswana. That's this country, okay? This will become important in a moment. And finally, these kinds of early human societies, hunter-gatherer societies, are enormously appealing when they are side by side with the modern world, as occasionally they have been in history. Typically, the struggle for quote, civilized societies is to keep individuals from fleeing into the tribal communities. That the closeness of that system is enormously appealing. The Great Wall of China, many historians believe, was as much to keep the Chinese peasants in as to keep the Mongols out. Likewise, along the American frontier, colonists, farmers were constantly absconding into the wilderness to join the tribal societies. It never happened in the reverse, according to contemporaries of that era. So here is a final thing about early human societies, which is fascinating. There is, and very important, all human societies are divided almost exactly 50-50 into conservative and liberal political beliefs, okay? Conservatism is typified by a skepticism or distrust or even animosity of strangers, an extreme protectiveness, an investment in hierarchy, in ideals of sanctity, of purity. Liberals are less concerned with outside threats and more concerned with internal threats, being lack of justice, lack of fairness, income disparities. If you have too great a gap between rich and poor, it is destabilizing to the group. And if the group splits, everyone's in danger. Okay? So all human societies are divided almost 50-50, and what they have found through studies of identical versus fraternal twins who are raised separately, that 40 to 60% of the variance in political belief, whether you are at your core a conservative or a liberal, 40 to 60% of the variance is genetically determined. Think about that. Our political beliefs are partially derived from our genetics, which makes perfect sense. A society that doesn't have at least some people in it that are oriented towards an outward threat will not survive for long. It will be overrun. A society that does not attend to internal ideals of fairness and justice will divide and fracture and fail. The idea that there is a genetic component to these two basic ways of keeping a group of people safe means it was adaptive. If it's encoded in our chromosomes, it was adaptive. We are the product of earlier humans who evolved these strategies and encoded them in their genetics in order to defend themselves not only against enemies, but against their own worst impulses within their community. If you don't believe me, there's a wonderful book by a writer named Avi Tushman called Our Political Nature that goes into this fascinating phenomenon in depth. So what it means is in our current political atmosphere, if a conservative says about liberals, oh, you're wrong, you're immoral, and you don't deserve to exist, in evolutionary terms or Darwinian terms, they are wrong. Well, likewise, when liberals say that about conservatives, they are wrong. We are wrong. I'm just going to stop saying they when I refer to the left. I'm just going to say we because that's what I am. I assume most of the people in this room are as well. So here is the grim news. In an evolutionary sense, in a biological sense, in a genetic sense, it is the left, the liberals of any community, the genetic and cultural liberals of any community, that are charged with advocating for and ensuring fairness and justice within the community. Not so much with defense, right? And you can see that I've been with the military a lot. I mean, they trend conservative. I'm sorry, even the 20-year-olds. Like, it's an unavoidable truth of the military that they trend conservative, right? And likewise in social justice movements, et cetera, people involved in those things trend liberal. Great, that's how evolution would have it. It's how the human race is supposed to work, and it works quite well like that. But here's the problem for us in America right now. The left is charged with advocating for fairness and justice and keeping this country from fracturing along tribal lines, right? That sort of falls on us, culturally and genetically, to do that. And we are failing. And we are failing not just in our results. We're failing our own standards. In my lifetime, the left wing of this political left wing of this country has become more and more an elite institution. We have completely lost the blue-collar, working-class vote. Not just white blue-collar workers, but people of color as well. We have lost their vote. Within my lifetime, we have given that voting bloc up to conservatives, who, of course, we're only too happy to scoop them up. The conversation we will not have is about class. Liberals will not talk about class. Gender, great, super important. Race, absolutely, super important. Neurodiversity, there's a long list, crucial to running a fair society. But we refuse to talk about class. That is tragic. The Gini income discrepancy, a bad Gini coefficient, is a known predictor, a known correlate of civil unrest and violence and the undermining of democratic ideals. It is known to precede those outcomes. So when we refuse to have a conversation about class, we are dooming this country to a terrible and catastrophic split. And I'm going to say something very uncomfortable, but I think and I hope we all know it to be true. I totally understand the idea of white and white male privilege. I totally get it, of course. I think probably we all do in this room. A young white man in Kentucky working a blue-collar job or in coal mines or whatever, in no rational sense, in no real sense, in the real world, does that young man have the political clout, the economic resources, the economic future, the cultural clout of a person of color getting a law degree from Princeton? They just don't. And is that the only conversation to have around all this? Of course not. But it's one of the conversations that we must have. Because otherwise, you lose that person in Kentucky. You lose him most recently to someone called Donald Trump. We have to have that conversation. The other abdication of our responsibility is that we have completely abandoned the idea of patriotism and love of country. We have left those noble words, those noble ideas, we have left them, again, to conservatives who have mangled those words, those good words, those fine ideals, beyond all recognition. We have left them. I am fully aware of the flaws of this country, the tragedies in our history, the crimes in our history. As a journalist, I've partly made my living writing about those things. I get it. I don't need to be schooled on that. I don't think anyone in this room does. But let's remember, we fought our bloodiest war, a civil war, to stop slavery. Hundreds of thousands of young white men died ending slavery in our Civil War. And we did it again to stop fascism in World War II, as my father kept telling me, right? At one point, I got my card for selective service in the mail. I grew up during Vietnam, the draft, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, what the hell is this? The government wants to know where I live so they can draft me if they need me? I'm not signing this. My father was, no, you are definitely signing that. And he was an implacable pacifist. He said, I know you're signing that. He said, if there's a war that's immoral, it's your moral duty to protest it and go to jail if need be, protesting it. But you may need, you don't know, you may need to fight fascism again, in which case you may owe your country your life. I hope not. But you do owe your country something, and it may be your life, depending on what happens. So you're signing that card. And when he said that, all of a sudden I was enormously proud to sign it. We are among the first to bring in suffrage, women's rights, labor laws, civil rights. If you think we don't owe our country something, if one does not owe one's country something, ask the Ukrainians about that idea. See what they say. So when we, as a political force, walk away from those amazing ideas, leave them to be picked up by people who I think use them irresponsibly, what we're doing is saying, look, we want the country to be united, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but we can't actually offer you a good and positive emotional reason to believe in this place. When you don't offer someone the positive reasons to believe in one's tribe, you open the door, wide open, to the negative tribalism that has taken this country by storm in the last decade or so. That's the problem with abdicating on those responsibilities as liberals. And I'm going to wrap up here. I know we're running out of time, but the final thing. This is my phone. It's a flip phone. The final thing is the liberal love affair with technology, with smartphones. They go against all of our values, I'm sorry. They are a known addiction, right? The data are in. They are known to damage, threaten the mental health and physical health of our young people. Anxiety, depression, suicide attempts have skyrocketed since the advent of these infernal devices. And of course, they are known to inflame partisan hate and divisiveness with their infernal algorithms that just give us the truths that we prefer to believe. One of the saddest things I think I've ever seen was an inspiring speech by Barack Obama. His last speech of his presidency, I believe it was on New Year's Eve in Chicago. Thousands of adoring people in a huge auditorium. One of the last things he said was, and may we, in the coming year, in the new year, may we all spend less time on our phones. And the crowd cheered wildly while holding aloft their phones to record the moment. That is the irony, the hypocrisy, and the tragedy of the state of liberal thought in this country at this moment. If we can address those three things, I think we'll be on our way to healing this country. Thank you so much for the privilege to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. That was fantastic and inspiring. I just want to start with some of the things you said at the end because they were, I think, they're deeply meaningful. You said that we, speaking as a liberal, and I wonder exactly what you mean by a liberal. Maybe you could even elaborate on that. As a political force, have walked away from emotional reason to believe in this country and tribes. What is an emotional reason that liberals can get behind to believe in this country?
I'm inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King, and therefore I love this country and what it's capable of at its best, and I'm willing to serve this country in any way that it needs, including, if need be, sacrificing my life to preserve it. I mean, that is a positive emotional appeal, not an abstract intellectual one.
And why is that failing? Why is that not working? Why do you think the left has run away from patriotism and nationalism. Left has run away from class. How can class become an emotional appeal to the left?
Well, I'm not saying that everything has to be emotional, but the decision, the political decision to stop paying attention to, advocating for and paying attention to working class voters has led to, I think, the demographic collapse of the Democratic Party, where we're in a, cliffhanger vote against, someone who I think is just a straight up fascist, right? I mean, I'm sorry. I sort of understand his appeal for some people, but it shouldn't be close. And if we had the support of working class people across the country, if we attended to their needs and listened to them and mostly respected them from our elite institutions, it wouldn't even be close. But it's close, and it's on us. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, it is on us. We can demonize the GOP all we want. Go for it. It's fun to do, right? But it is on us, ultimately, that it came to this terrible impasse.
One of the things that first, I think when I read your book, Tribe, one of the things that struck me was the way you connected the epidemic in mental illness today to a kind of liberal civilization that doesn't speak the language of tribe and that is allergic to the idea of tribe. And you cite Benjamin Franklin and other contemporary observers who talk about how it was the colonists who went and joined the Ramble and the Indian and the Native American tribes, and never the other way, that the tribalists came and joined Western civilization. Anyone who's teaching in a college campus today knows that there's an epidemic of depression and anxiety amongst young people. I've experienced it personally in friends and family and amongst students. How do you think? What is a kind of tribal? Obviously there's a missing tribalism in our lives today. How do you address this in your life, in the lives of your friends? How do you think we can begin to make our lives more tribal in this sense that won't kill us?
Well, just first of all, permit me to hit this again. The alienating effects of cell phone obsession are devastating to our sense of belonging to anything, right? I'm sorry, it can't be done. If I'm remembering the numbers correctly, it's particularly dangerous for young women, for teenage girls. I'm a father of two girls, right? I'm very concerned about this. They are not allowed any devices any more than we don't buy them packs of cigarettes. Come on, are you kidding? I think the number is that the average teenage girl spends 40 hours a week on their phone. You're not going to experience tribe in its positive sense when that much time is being taken up doing something that irrelevant and ephemeral as looking at pixels on a screen. I'm sorry, it's not happening, right? So first of all, I think there is if we want to sort of heal the society, there's a few sort of simple things. First of all, I think we need sensible and realistic safeguards against the the toxic effects of cell phone technology, particularly on young people. We have to protect them. I think mandatory national service would do an enormous, would be an enormous blessing in this country in terms of breaking down these awful class and race and education and political divisions. This is one of the things the military is great at, puts everyone in one pot and stirs them up. And like it or not, you get to know your brothers and sisters in the country, right? And therein is the beginning of, okay, what happens to you happens to me. I don't care who you are. Those two things would be enormously good. And at the individual level, now I'll send it back to you, but just at the individual level, what can you do as an individual to feel part of something greater than yourself? This is a huge, wealthy, mechanized country. We're tiny individuals. How can we feel like we're part of something, right? There's three ways. I almost died of blood loss 4 years ago. I needed 10 units of blood to save my life. I came within minutes of dying, okay? I survived because 10 people donated their blood. 10 people I'll never know donated their blood. Now my daughters will have a father, okay? Donate blood. It will save someone who is loved by many other people. And it may one day save you or your child, right? Donate blood. You will feel part of something greater than yourself, which is one of the most intoxicating feelings that humans can experience. Serve jury duty. Do not come up with some bullshit reason that you're too busy. I'm sorry. Jury duty is what protects us against tyranny. It means that no one person, no one sheriff, no one judge, no one president, no one anything can decide the fate of another person. And if you are ever accused of a crime, you will be given a jury of your peers. If you never serve jury duty, you won't deserve one, but you'll get one anyway. And finally, vote. And what I would say at this point, it's wonderful to vote on policy. What a luxury. Fantastic. We're not there anymore. This is where we are. Vote for the person who will unify this country rather than destroy it. And that is, I think for some time, that will be true in every election, probably within my lifetime. That actually will be the deciding factor for me, not what their particular policies are, but what their character is and whether they are approaching their job in this country with love and courage and benevolence, or selfishness and callousness and nihilism.
I love what you said about jury duty. I've never been able to get on a jury. They don't like me. Especially when I tell them I study jury nullification. They don't seem to like that. But one of the people I really like, Alexis de Tocqueville, said that the most important institution in American democracy is the jury. Because what the jury does is it takes a small group of people and it teaches them to put aside their private ideas of justice and to elevate above their own opinions and decide what is right and wrong. And it trains them in how to think from the public perspective of the country rather than the private. We, especially many of us who can escape jury duty because we think we're too important, we're too busy, etc. We at the Arendt Center are very much involved in a group, in a movement called citizen assemblies or civic assemblies or citizen juries, where instead of in law, in politics, we bring randomly chosen groups of people together to talk for days or weeks about a particular issue, again, to try and elevate the discussion. It's a way of trying to create a sense of belonging and tribal nature. I mean, that's this idea of civic virtue, right, of Americans who used to go to town hall meetings and actually participate, has really suffered greatly. And I think that relates to your jury question. And somehow we need to figure out a way to bring that back into our daily lives.
You know, it's still out there in these surprising forms. I read one of the columnists for the New York Times, David French, wrote an amazing piece where he had, he started out as a Republican, maybe he still is, I don't know, but he's been, a really implacable critic of Donald Trump and the Republican apologists for Donald Trump. And as a result, he started getting death threats and things like that. And at one point, he was particularly worried, and the police dispatched a cruiser to his house. And he talked to the young officer who was there to guard the lives of his family. And the policeman said, what did you do to deserve this? And he said, well, I criticized Donald Trump. And in an article that I wrote, and the cop said, well, I'll tell you what, he said, I vote Republican, and I'm going to continue to, but how about this? You keep writing those articles, and I'll keep protecting you. So there it is, and Georgia, wherever David French lives, there it is in that young man. Extraordinary, right? So it's there. What about cultural exchange programs, not between, France and Boston or Senegal and Denver or whatever? What about cultural exchange programs for young people between red states and blue states, between red communities and blue communities, where teenagers go spend a summer living with and working with a family from the opposite end of the political spectrum? What about that? Like, that would help. Like, this is now a generational time scale. Now, we're not going to fix this by tomorrow or next year. It's going to be, maybe our grandchildren, but if we don't start, it won't be them either. So we might as well start, right?
So we're going to open it up in a second. I just want to ask one last question here, and I'll open it up for questions. I loved your new definition of tribe that you offered today. It may be the first time you've given it, right? I don't know. What happens to you happens to me. If you're in danger, I'm in danger. And you talked about it as an intoxicating experience. Where have you had that kind of intoxicating experience? Where have you felt that?
The first time I experienced it, of course, if you have a family, if you have children, it arises very, very naturally. It's almost unstoppable, right, if you're a psychologically healthy person. But the first time I experienced it with, as I said when I was speaking, same-sex peers. It makes evolutionary sense to risk your life to defend your offspring. You're protecting your genetic investment in the next generation. It sort of makes, mathematical and genetic sense to do that. Sometimes even to protect your mate, your spouse. It makes no sense in Darwinian terms, or it appears to make no sense, to die protecting a same-sex peer who will go on to have children and you don't, and you lose the Darwinian competition for duplicating your DNA, right? How does that work? We're the only species that does that. Even chimpanzees don't do that, right? We do. It's one of the things that makes us both extraordinary and able to thrive in a threatening natural world. I first experienced that in combat with American forces. I wasn't carrying a rifle, I was carrying a video camera. And I was with them off and on for a year. I became really part of the platoon in every emotional and psychological sense. Absolutely zero objectivity about what they were doing, but I wasn't looking for objectivity about the war. I was looking for the subjective experience of what it feels like to be a soldier in any war, in any unit. What's it feel like? And I got to experience that. And this feeling of loyalty to the group, once you feel it, it's almost like this sort of riptide taking you away from this familiar shore out into these sort of unknown reaches. And then you're like, oh, I'm fine out here. The swimming's good out here. I like this, right? And it was it happened very, very quickly, and it was reciprocated, right, by the men in the platoon towards myself and my colleague Tim Hetherington. There are downsides to it. If anything happens to any of your brothers or sisters, psychologically, you decide immediately and forever that it was your fault, no matter the circumstances. Tim was killed in Libya. My colleague Tim Hetherington was killed in Libya during the Civil War on an assignment I was supposed to be on. He was hit by shrapnel from a mortar fired by Gaddafi's forces outside the city of Misrata. He bled out, like I almost did. He bled out 6,000 miles away from New York. I had nothing to do with it. And when I found out, I had a catastrophic reaction of guilt and shame that it wasn't me, that I wasn't there to protect him, it should have been me, and one that I will never, I don't think I'll ever quite recover from. That's the downside of this profound love. There's no better word, no other word, profound love that can be experienced as a group.
Thank you very much. There's much more to say, but I'd like to offer it up to people in the audience to ask questions and really encourage a wide range of questions. We have people with mics, I think, running around and helping you out. So, questions. In the back, red a shirt. Oh no, are you pointing to someone or over there? Someone in the back, up there. Who's got a question?
Yeah.
Please stand up and if you could say, just introduce yourself briefly so we all know.
I'm Austin. I'm with the Dalton School. We're here. We're all in high school. I guess my question would be that you sort of talk about the way that liberals have almost like completely lost the working class vote. I sort of wonder why you think that they've allowed that to happen, or how that's sort of gone down recently, and why, you know, Republicans are still able to contain that vote despite, you know, seating division in the way that you talked about.
I don't know how it happened or why. I mean, I just don't know. I just know that it did happen. It clearly did happen. One of the things that I dislike about my political tribe is its sense of superiority and elitism and excellence, and as if it knows best, and often it does, but not always. And that sense of superiority, I think, is extremely off-putting. And it comes from these amazing, you know, partly from having access. If you have resources, you have access to amazing institutions of learning. I went to Wesleyan in Connecticut. I was able to go there because my parents had money. You know, I'm sorry, that was just, you know, my father was not a pipe fitter in Detroit. He was a physicist in Cambridge, right? So the life that I live and the work that I've done that I'm very proud of came in large part out of that good fortune that I experienced and didn't necessarily deserve. And so I think we lost, I'll just say we again, I think we lost the working class vote because we're not working class. Like the sort of party leaders are not working class. They used to be some generations ago, and the working class concerns simply stopped mattering because we didn't think they were important.
Thanks very much. Let's go over this side. Thomas in the back up there.
Thank you. I'm Thomas, and I teach here at Bard. I'd like to recreate a little bit of your argument and then ask a question. It's something I don't understand, and you can either correct the way I'm presenting it or answer the question. So as I understand it, you're saying that in broad strokes, that the job of the liberals is to sustain, the job of the liberals in a society is to sustain the internal coherence of the society, one job of it. And the job of the conservatives is to protect from external threat. And the one of the problems with liberals in the US is that it's failed because it hasn't activated the tribal energies that are necessary to hold it together. And so what I'm wondering is, if it did activate those tribal energies and it became a stronger tribe, why wouldn't that then be turned against the conservatives? And rather than doing the task that I think you're saying is the task, to hold the society together, it would then just result in further fragmentation.
Right. So, I mean, great question, and maybe I was imprecise in how I discussed this. What I meant by inspiring a tribal loyalty, what isn't a tribal loyalty to liberalism, the liberals. It's a tribal loyalty to the country. So one way that they could do that is by espousing the concerns of working class conservatives. Like, hey, you're an American too. What happens to you happens to me. And your leaders, we don't think are going to actually seriously attend to your economic troubles. But we will, even though you vote against us in every election, we will, because we believe in this country. That's what I mean by a tribal ethos applied to the entire nation. And by job, I mean, understand what I mean by, you use the word job, but what we mean by that is that in terms of our human evolution as a species, our adaptation to the stresses of the natural world and the stresses of the social world that we created, the typical concern and domain of conservatives, of genetic and cultural conservatives, is orienting towards an outside threat so that we are safe, right? And the typical concerns of liberals, genetic and cultural liberals, is orienting towards an internal threat, meaning unfairness, injustice, inequality, so that we remain safe internally. Those are the typical concerns of those two groups. I'm not saying it's their jobs in the society, but they're the typical concerns. And so if we as liberals fail to attend to the things that are actually fracturing the group, if we just ignore them, if we fail to sort of like sound the fire alarm, like there's a fire in the house, then we are falling down on our job, right? To use that word, that what we see to be our job, our domain, our political and cultural and moral domain, we are failing at it. And if we don't do it, they're not going to, and they're saying the same thing. If we don't protect the country, the left certainly isn't going to. We're going to have to do this. And, good on you, right? They're kind of right, and we're kind of right. It worked quite well at 50-50 if everyone respects each other.
I mean, one of the things, just about to go back to the class issue that you talked about, the top 10 or 20 metropolitan areas in this country have become over 90% in the top 1% of the income in this country. There's almost no one left. And so what you see is these different tribes of kind of elites and others living in just completely different worlds. They don't interact as much as they used to. They're not on the bus, they're not on the subway, they're not together in the restaurants, and they've almost created separate worlds. Let's see. There's a lot. In the back there, waving your hand. You, yes. Stand up, please. Yeah.
So I'm a teacher from Bar, DC. It's really great to be here. So I have a question about in terms of in education. A little background of myself. I'm from China. Where only one voice is allowed. When I came to this country, I was amazed at how people argue about one same thing, and you can hear two voices. This is a precious thing of American democracy, I think. But more and more I realize when I'm teaching students, for example, I'm teaching a seminar called Justice, Democracy, and Immigration. And all my students, I think they are so liberal, which is also a good thing, But sometimes when you even mention that isn't American, when you want to present another perspective, like isn't American is a sovereign country with policies, we should have immigration policies. What do you do with those regulations, right? When it comes to undocumented immigrants, and they will call you patriotism, and they call you racism, and so they are so liberal that they almost feel like this is the balance, right? We need to stand between these two ideologies. So my question is, what's your suggestion in terms of in education to balance these two ideologies?
Well, yeah, extremism in all its forms is abhorrent and destroys the moral fabric, the social fabric of a community. And the left wing is great at extremism, I'm sorry. And they're particularly good at enforcing language. Like, you have to speak this way, right? Repeat after me. And, the right wing, and, trust me, I don't have a lot of warm feelings towards the right wing at the moment. They don't do that as badly as we do, for some reason. And it happens in the universities, and it's appalling, right? And it's also the sort of embryonic form of a fascist state on the left, on the left side, right? So, how do you handle that? I don't know. If universities don't stand behind, if professors stand up to that kind of nonsense, and then are penalized by being furloughed or fired by the university, you will never fix it, right? The universities have to stand behind the professors, and the political left has to stand behind the universities when we insist on respectful respectful norms in our dialogue, and that virtually all ideas may be considered and compared and discussed, except ideas that are obvious insults to human dignity. Those no one has any use for, and I don't want them near me. But that's not really what we're talking about. Thank you. Good luck.
All the way in the back. And yeah, there's a mic right next to you.
Hi. I also have 2 daughters who are always glued to their cell phones, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, is perhaps the addiction due to the feeling of intoxication of belonging to virtual communities that they're in? I wonder about this and about thoughts about how to, help people separate those 2 things.
Well, thank you. I mean, Jonathan Haidt, if I pronounced his last name correctly, wrote an amazing book about this, and he's an authority. I'm not, but just shamelessly stealing from his good work, I'll say that they're glued to their phones because the companies that devised these devices and these algorithms were cunning and evil in their plans, right? So they set out to design algorithms that would create addiction, an addiction of attention, right? That will take people's attention and not allow them to let go. So what Instagram did, as if I remember correctly from Jonathan's work, what Instagram did was, I guess I'm not on social media, but I guess if you post a photograph, and then one of the little pleasures is that people like it, like a thumbs up or something, right? So, and you sort of post your photograph and you sort of wait to see how many people like it, and you get a little dose of dopamine, right? How nice, right? So what Instagram figured out is that if they withheld the likes, you post your photograph, like, don't I look cute in front of the sunset, or look at me in the soccer game, whatever, and no one says anything, it creates this sort of like cyclone of anxiety, particularly in a young person. And they keep checking their phone constantly to see if anyone's gonna like their recent best effort. What the companies are trying to do is to get you to check your phone constantly, on your phone constantly. And if you create anxiety, you will do that, right? And then they give you all the likes at once. And you get finally flooded with dopamine. Now you're an addict. Now you're anxious and you're an addict. Excellent, right? So this was done on purpose by these companies. They have made trillions of dollars on off the mental well-being of our young people and of all of us. Trillions of dollars. I think it's Google. I believe it's Google. The amount of wealth that they control, if it were a nation, I think they'd be ranked 19th in the world. All right? Think about that. While we're on the Gini coefficient for a moment, some dozens of people control half the wealth on the planet. Right? They control the wealth of half of this planet. Right? As much, I believe, as they control as much wealth as the bottom half of this planet, some dozen or so people. That is the income inequality, and a certain amount of it are these tech giants. So, my heart breaks for your daughters. And belonging to something online, it's like saying Cheetos are a food. I mean, they'll fill you up, but it's not food, right? I mean, belonging to something online actually is not a human experience. It feels like it, but it actually doesn't have any of the nutrients that a in the flesh or even a phone call has for the human brain, right? So, I mean, I know you get in a lot of trouble, but I would take those things and drop them in the Hudson River.
A bunch. And then, yeah, there'll be more conversations. So if you don't get it here, we can always come back. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'll need a mic. Can we get a mic for Jason?
Thank you. So you spoke about like the failure of liberals to appeal emotionally to like just regular people. And so thinking of cosmopolitans as a tribe, as Roger was explaining, do you see that failure of emotional appeal opening people up to cosmopolitanism and the appeals of that in the same way that like conservatives are able to like scoop them up?
Yeah, I mean, so to the extent that I understand the word, I'm not even quite exactly sure what the definition is, but it feels like a rather intellectual pursuit, which is great. Look, my dad was a physicist. I mean, I'm all for intellectual pursuits, right? And sort of thoughtful worldviews and all that. I'm not sure. Cosmopolitanism doesn't need to be an emotional reality for people. It's part of our intellectual society. It's part of how we understand the world. What I was simply saying is that if you want to motivate people, you have to tap into a visceral emotional response to get them to do things like run across minefields or whatever. Like if you want to get them to do hard, dangerous things, you have to appeal to their emotions. One of the things that's hard and dangerous and uncomfortable and frightening maybe is reaching out across the aisle to someone of the opposite political party and say, hey there, brother, hey there, sister, we're in this together, right? But if you want people to do that, you have to appeal to their sense of like, hey, we're all Americans. What's that feel like? Not what is like, oh, I admire the Constitution. That's an intellectual experiment and a worthy one. It's great, right? But what's it feel like to be an American citizen? What's that feel like? What about it are you proud of? And if you can find some common ground in someone who votes exactly opposite to you, that they're also proud of the same thing about being American, now you have to start a conversation that will sideline all of the politicians on both parties that count on partisan difference to gain office. You have just short-circuited them and are now in conversation with your fellow citizens. Like that's how this works, in my opinion. And you have to do that on a visceral level, not at an intellectual level. That intellectual level has other purposes, other uses. It doesn't work so well when you're, say, motivating the people of Ukraine to fight off the Russian military, right? They're doing that for their families, for their country, for their heritage, for their freedom. All very, very basic emotional realities.
I'm wondering, you've covered a lot of wars, and I'm sure you know a lot of people fighting in Ukraine or covering the war in Ukraine. There's obviously also a lot of people in Ukraine who left Ukraine, and I've talked to some of them, and they've said, this is a stupid war. You know, I don't really care who runs Ukraine. You know, I'd rather not have war. How does that fit? I mean, it seems to me that takes a position of, I'd rather live in peace without this suffering, and it doesn't really matter to me if I'm Ukrainian or Russian or whatever. Is that overly? It doesn't seem intellectual. That seems quite emotional. They want to not have war.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, the Jews of Europe in the middle of the last century, I'm sure would have preferred to live in peace than have war. But that wasn't really on the menu, was it? Right. So what they're saying is what they're actually saying is I'd rather be a refugee. I'd rather make another country, another people, my tribe, than remain Ukrainian and fight. Fine, no problem, right? I mean, whatever, do what you're gonna do. Like it doesn't, but they are no longer Ukrainian in any moral sense, right? To be Ukrainian at this particular moment means to stay and defend Ukraine. And if you're not interested in defending Ukraine because it's just not that important to you, I got no problem with you. At least you're honest about it. And you move to France or the US or whatever, welcome, you're great. Like, nice to have you, But I don't, there's no platoon, there's no company of infantry, there's no country really that wants people in their ranks that they think they can depend on who actually are not committed to what happens to you happen to me. You're using up resources, you're a waste of time, go somewhere else, we're good, we don't need you. Like I don't have any problem with that. And I don't know what I would do if I was Ukrainian. I'd like to think I would stay and fight, but I don't know. I mean, I've never been in that situation. If some rebels came rolling down the highway towards this town, what would you do? Would would you grab the cutlasses and shotguns and rush out to meet them and stop them before they overran Bard College, right? Would you? I don't know. Who would fight to defend Bard right now? Like physically, risk dying. Like,
Who would fight?
oh, wow. Well, we got a good dozen. Okay, good. All right.
Hi, David Matius. I'm one of the board members for the Arendt Center. And thank you, Sebastian. Great talk. As a historical note and then a question. The historical note is, I think it was 10 years ago, and Roger, correct me on this, that Ralph Nader spoke here.
More than 10, yeah.
Yeah, and called for pretty much the identical service requirement on young adults, but to do a year in civil service as opposed to military. And at the time, I think that was, I found that a bit unusual, but in context, it was very prescient. The question I have for you is around the notion or the concept of cognitive dissonance, a psychological term that was documented in the 50s, I believe, by Leon Festinger, and has come to, in my view, epitomize some of the irrational behavior that you have with our different tribes, especially left and right in America. But the propensity for us as a species to make what we think to be rational choice based on imperfect information, based on maybe a prior decision or a decision made by someone else within our tribe. And I know I'm grossly overstating it, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how that plays into your paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, cognitive dissonance is unbearable, right? We have these ideas and ideals that make us feel like we've sort of basically figured out the world, and so we know how to operate within it. And then something comes along that challenges that, and it makes us extremely uncomfortable. And, you know, I think one of the, you know, I think there's a certain amount of cognitive dissonance going on the right wing with January 6th. Like, I think a lot of those people, a lot of the right wing believes that their party to be a party that represents good and hopeful prospects for America. And I think they know perfectly well that what happened on January 6th is a travesty of those very ideals. And they don't know what to do with it because it was all conservatives there practically, right? So that's, it's an unbearable thing. So one of the things that people do when they're confronted with that is just say, you know what, I don't want to hear about it, it's not true, la, 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 la. I mean, they just plug their ears, right? I mean, there's a lot of that going on the right wing, but there's just as much on the left wing, right? I mean, one of the things that the left wing doesn't want to hear is that they're an elitist organization, right? I mean, sorry, because they're founded on these ideals of like the common man and blah, 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 and it's all wonderful, except that's 3 generations ago now, and we still have this sort of idea of ourselves, but the reality is really different. And a brief personal story to show you how volatile this stuff is for people. It can happen at the individual level very, very easily, the personal level very, very easily. I had a girlfriend for a while who's bipolar. I really struggled with that before I sort of understood it. She's okay now, but before she understood it, at one point she accused me of being anxious to leave a family gathering. And I said, well, what made you think that? And she said, you kept looking at your watch. And I showed her my wrists. I said, I'm not wearing a watch. And she went nuts, right? She could not bear the fact that her idea and reality were not in concordance. And so, you can't ask people to do inhuman things, and resolving that kind of dissonance is not within the capability of most humans. It just will not work. You can show the January 6th evidence over and over and over again to people on the right, and they are not going to absorb it. They can't afford to, because their whole worldview collapses, as it did with poor Judy in that moment.
We've got time for a couple more questions. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I can't see everybody, so I appreciate that. Right there, then.
Hi, thank you, by the way. My name is Arav, and I go to Dalton. And you touch a lot on this idea about like working class voters, and I was sort of wondering, I mean, in terms of a lot of policies for the upcoming election on things like free trade or like Obamacare or NATO, Trump in some ways is taking on a like quote unquote progressive stance in terms of like we need to make change, and Kamala Harris is taking on a stance of like we need to preserve the established policy, which in some ways might be liberal. So I guess in terms of working class shifts, could it be more associated with their, like the conservative and liberal realignment towards conservatives becoming this idea of we need to move in a certain direction, and liberals saying we need to keep what we already have on a lot of policies? And might that explain why working class voters have kind of shifted towards Republicans instead of like conservatives necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, listen, these policy debates, I mean, these issues are extremely complex, right? And even economists don't entirely understand the full implications of this stuff, right? So voters aren't necessarily going to. But what they do, what they can identify very, very easily is tribe, right? So working class voters look around and they, I think, are instilled, as they were in, say, the 1940s, when working class voters were tended to be democratic to the point of being almost socialist. They see a basic dignity in hard work, a love of country, a patriotism, a love of the flag. I mean, you see it at MAGA rallies all the time, right? The American flag is everywhere. So they're, you know, what people are not necessarily voting their interests in a sophisticated economic sense. They're voting their tribal affiliations as well they might. I mean, look, we're humans. We're social primates. I mean, social primates, right? We're trained to understand that our safety comes from being around others who are very much like us. That's where we get our safety from, right? So when you give up, when the left wing has given up the cultural markers of working class reality, just given them up, they were wide open for the Republicans to seize. And I mean, there was a time when liberals, left-wing people flew the American flag proudly in their front yard, right? I mean, and now, I mean, there are communities where if you fly the American flag, you will be told that you're a fascist. Like, I'm sorry, that's just not true. Like, and so those cultural things are what determine a lot of voting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to something Sebastian said here and earlier, which is policies are great, but people are voting on tribalism. And one of the most fascinating things about these two current tribes that we're talking about is that this presidential candidate, former president Donald Trump, who lies more incessantly than almost anyone I can imagine in public office, is seen by so many people as a truth teller. Now, that doesn't mean they always believe his lies. I mean, if they're asked, you'll get $100 if you tell me the truth about whether he helped organize January 6th, they'll say, yes, he did, and he was wrong. But they see him as a truth teller because he speaks his mind. He doesn't censor himself. And you look at Kamala Harris, every question she's asked, you can see the wheels turning. How am I going to spin this to not offend this person or that person? And that's a big part of the different tribes that we're seeing in the world. People feel that they're constantly on edge, and they're rebelling against that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the liberal investment in rationality, right? And, you know, I thought that if I showed Judy that I wasn't wearing a watch, it would end the argument. All it did was make it explode because she couldn't deal with the fact that she was, like, clearly, obviously wrong. It made her really, really angry, which was part of her psychological struggle. But so, you know, Kamala Harris, I think the left is always doing this. It's like, no, let me explain the policy to you again. And if you get it, you'll vote for me, right? Like, wow, that's so naive. Like, that's so sweet. That's so innocent to think that, right? And the right, you know, Donald Trump is a master at triggering powerful emotions in people. Sometimes ugly, sometimes not, but powerful emotions. And one of the things that Kamala Harris, I think, is doing a little bit, thank God, is going to this sort of like, wow, like amazing to feel like a joyful American. How nice to feel that again. You know, that's a real feeling. Like she's doing that a little bit, and it's a welcome relief, and we need more of that positivist, emotional, liberal argument for voting, right? Like, and we have a long way to go before we get to the sort of love of country, proud of America, but proud of America, but willing to discuss in honest terms its obvious flaws. Like that, for me, that's the sweet spot. But if you don't have the proud, you know, I love this country and I'm proud of it. If you don't have that, you are going to lose elections. Just face it, accept it, right? That is what will happen. So there's our choice right there. How do we do it?
There's a lot of hands up. The bad news is we're out of time, and I've got to get the next panel up here, which is an amazing panel as well. The good news is that Sebastian is going to be here, and at 1:30 in this room have a breakout session where you can ask him more questions. Please join me in thanking Sebastian Junger.